Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I'm your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm bringing you several replays of past interviews with filmmakers whose work will be showing at the 20th Annual HollyShorts Film Festival this August. Before I get started, please make sure you subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they're released. If you like the show and want to hear more interviews in the future, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. The first former guest I reached out to was Nazrin Choudhury. We spoke back in February following her nomination for Best Live Action Short Film at the Oscars and talked about her film, Red, White, and Blue. She wrote back to say, quote, "The Oscars was a wonderful experience, and although we didn't win, we know it must have been a tight race from the overwhelming outpouring of love and support for the film, which reaffirmed all of the reasons why we made the film, which was to tell a characterful and human story around the issue of reproductive rights." Nazrin went on to mention how she and her team continue to receive messages telling them that they feel seen by the film or that it has helped change their view on reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy. The film is currently in the midst of an impact campaign, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Nazrin also mentioned that the film is screening in several states around the country to help raise funds for the partners they are working with. She and her team are working on making the film available on a streaming platform to give it wider access. But in the meantime, you can rent the film at redwhiteandblue.vhx.tv, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. Nazrin herself is working on developing her first full-length feature that she plans to direct, and also writing a social horror film that she wants to direct. So keep an eye out for more from her in the future. And here's a clip from our interview.
Well, I think as a writer, everything I do, there has to be a personal connection to it. And I think most of the best stories have that connection. And so for me, specifically to do with Red, White, and Blue, I myself have a lived experience in which I needed the same procedure as an abortion, but for a non-viable pregnancy. I was already a mother of two young daughters at the time. And without this procedure, for a pregnancy that just was not going to go to term in any way, shape, or form, I needed to have that healthcare in order to be alive today, to be the mother to my two girls. That's kind of one layer of resonance and connection to it. The other layer is the fact that I have two teenage daughters who will be inheriting the legacy of the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade. And so trying to think about the fact that for the majority of my life, whether it was in the UK or the US, I have been able to rely on the security of knowing that that healthcare is on offer to me. But my children are inheriting a landscape in which that is not afforded to them. And that is an entirely daunting and frightening place for them to be. And you mentioned your wife, which, I think is so deeply meaningful to me that you're watching it and then you're sharing it with your wife, who is having her own very unique experience because maybe of her lived experiences too. I think that's the case for so many people here in this country dealing with the real world repercussions of it. And the reason why they might be responding to our film, it's appropriately titled Red, White, and Blue, because it does affect every single person living in this country. Everybody knows someone who has had an abortion, whether you agree with it or not. Right. Someone has had to have an abortion for a very important reason, not just the reasons that we go into in our film. Whatever it may be, no one goes into it lightly. There is an emotional, physical, psychological toll that is put upon you if you have to go through that. To have that then denied to you and to put yourself at risk or have someone be put at risk because they can't get that healthcare immediately and as close by to their homes as possible without having to go 2 states across at great expense, not just financially, but time-wise. That's a day's salary that someone might have to give up, and then some. to me, it was about bringing all of the sum of our experiences into this short and trying to pack as much of that storytelling in a dense way, yet simplifying it at the same time.
Next up was Courtney Dixon, who I spoke with ahead of her film Depression is a Beast, screening at Tribeca in June. Talking about her Tribeca experience, she called Tribeca a dream fest, expressing her joy that the schedule was packed with events and panels that emphasized networking for filmmakers. Her film played 7 times throughout Tribeca, and she said it got great reception, opening doors to local screenings in the weeks since the festival. Now that things are moving to the West Coast with HollyShorts, Courtney says she is, quote, excited about our shorts block scheduled for the closing night and in the company of some very talented filmmakers. HollyShorts selections screen at the famous TCL Chinese Theater, and it's the 20th anniversary, so it's a very special festival to be a part of. We have an amazing PR team, London Flair, and are looking forward to what comes next. Here is some of my interview with Courtney from earlier this spring.
Yeah, so I just backing up a little, I did go through actually postpartum depression, and so I spent there were several nights where I would just kind of get lost on the internet trying to figure out, what am I, like, just searching on the topic of depression. And I found an article that talked about, from the New York Times, that talked about how horror films can actually help with anxiety and depression. So I thought that was a really interesting take on it. So I just started thinking about, oh my gosh, what would it look like if a horror film made a PSA on depression? And then I was like, okay, so who could I get to tell the story? Because obviously, even though I was going through it, I didn't want to be on camera for it. And so I started searching. I actually started searching on Instagram, which is typically what I do for some of my doc subjects. I'll search via tags, and I'm looking up whatever the tag is related. And so I was, I think I was searching depression and all of these different topics so much. Actually, Instagram sent a pop-up message and said, "Are you okay? Are you dealing with anything?" And I had to say, "I'm okay, thank you." So that was interesting and great that they're doing that. And then I was like, I wasn't finding anyone that way. So I started actually I knew I wanted to find someone in the horror community. So I started dropping into people's DMs like, "Hey, I really love your work. Are you by chance depressed? Sorry to ask such a weird question." And that was not going over well. I'm sure people were like, who is this girl? And what is she saying to me? So I reached out to a friend of mine who is a really great horror film director, Ray, and he actually directed one of the films that Jenna was in, one of the recent horror films that she was in. And he was like, "Yeah, let me put you in touch with Jenna." And then I thought he was just meaning that Jenna was going to help me find someone. And then she got on the phone with me and she was like, "No, I'm interested. I want to be a part of this. This is a big advocacy outlet for me." So that's how it started. We kind of just fell into it together. And then from there, it shifted into, how can I tell Jenna's story, and listening to her personal backstory of what she had went through, how she deals with it. And then that's where we kind of came together on an idea. We did about 3 or 4 pre-interviews. So we were able to kind of sit down and be like, okay, I knew she was going to talk about, water being a big thing for her. And then, certain aspects of, she has a great line in the film where she talks about, depression is a monster, and it kind of follows her around everywhere. It's never going to go away. So she finally had to say to the monster, "You can be in the room with me, you can hang out, but you cannot sit on my lap anymore." And I loved that idea that we just, depression for some of us is going to be lifelong. And so it's like, how do you coexist and still thrive? So I loved her, sentiment to that.
Lastly, Julia Axe and Steve Pinder just touched down in LA on their way home from Indie Shorts, where they won the Comedy Award and Overall Audience Award. They told me what an incredible experience Tribeca was and how honored they were to be among some incredibly quality films. They sold out 3 screenings of their film, participated in a filmmaker soccer tournament, and bonded with fellow filmmakers, programmers, and staff right on the water in Brooklyn. Listen to what Julia and Steve had to say about their film, Jane Austen's period drama, in my previous interview with them.
I think part of it is we just love that period and that genre of film. But then also in terms of the comedy, that world that's so rich with social rules and propriety, it creates a really heightened circumstance for all the characters to live in. and for them to have to talk about these very human bodily problems
Right.
in a society that's built that way. It just makes everything funnier. And so you can sort of comment on, it makes it easy for us to comment on what's happening in our modern day world in a way that stands in relief.
And we obviously, like you said, have a fondness for parody, and taking familiar genres or familiar tropes and kind of flipping them on their heads. And so one of the advantages of taking a familiar world, even if people aren't Jane Austen fans, people know that Jane Austen films at least exist. And so once you enter into that world and do it as well as you can, there is already sort of the audience is with us, and already it allows us to kind of play even in an even edgier way and push the boundaries even further, because from the first shot to the first scene to the costumes to the everything, people are already like, oh, I already know the world that we're playing in.
A lot of
so
built-in expectation. We clearly love British humor and British storytelling. We did all the Julie Andrews stuff. I mean, there's something. My mom is British, and there's just something in British humor and British language that makes everything feel, I don't know, rich and also funny. And it especially at this time, there's such a proper way of speaking that if you have a character who's bound to a proper style of speech, and then they have to say something silly, again, you get this wonderful contrast.
Thank you so much to all of these guests. If you're in Los Angeles this August, check out Julia and Steve's film, Jane Austen's period drama, on August 11th at 2:30 p.m. Nazrin's film, Red, White, and Blue, on August 14th at 5 p.m. And Courtney's film, Depression is a Beast, on August 17th at 2:30 p.m., all at the TCL Chinese Theater in Hollywood. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eacherberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eacherberg. Please be sure to come back for my next episode, where I will be speaking with Rebecca King, director of the film Elsa. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.